Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this Risk Minds webinar. I'm Ed Stapley, the Editor-in-Chief for the Risk Minds conferences. We'll be live tweeting this webinar, so you can join in the conversation using the hashtag RMWebinar. So, what are the challenges in implementing FRTB, and why is this different compared to other regulatory programs? Well, understanding how they interrelate will impact the optimal design and configuration of each bank's FRTB implementation, possibly questioning the decision if you would want to build IMA altogether. The optimal delivery approach and how you would structure the work is key. It's clear that multiple stakeholders would need to be engaged and the right governance needs to be in place. Furthermore, the need for additional external support and possible use of utilities to deliver elements of the implementation are vital. So today I'm joined on the line with Bo Boyson, Senior Director of FRTB and Risk Data Platform at Nordea Markets, and he'll be discussing practical operational implementation of FRTB. So welcome to Bo, but before I do hand over to Bo for his presentation, I'd like to remind you all that we'll be holding an interactive Q&A after the presentation. So feel free to submit your questions while Bo's talking. You can also do this once he's completed his talk. But if you do have any questions at all, you can submit these using the orange Ask a Question button, which is at the bottom of your screen. So I'd like to hand over to Bo, who's going to kick things off now with his presentation.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you for inviting me for this webinar. Yes, indeed, the practical operational implementation of FRTB is a big topic, and it's a lot of ground to cover in a short space of time. But I shall try and do it as clear as possible. And what I will do is I'll focus a bit on the challenges, and it's really the biggest change I've seen for a long while in the industry, having been around for a long while doing regulatory change. I know it's a little paper of 100 odd pages, 88 pages, whatever it is. Yeah, 88 pages. Yeah, clearly it's a big change. That's why it's called the fundamental review. I would like that we look a little bit first on where it is we're heading to and the challenges there. So if we start at 12 o'clock and work our way clockwise downwards, there's a BCBS paper out there from January, and the question, of course, in everybody's mind is that the final version? Is it the final set of requirements that you need to implement on? And I think the answer there is, in most jurisdictions, no, it isn't. There will be changes as the BCBS paper is transpositioned into local legislation. The European Union does it through the CRR, and it's a process that's just started, and we're expecting a first draft here towards the end of October. Maybe it'll be delayed into November, but it's a process that started, and there are indications out there that there will be changes for the European Union. There are also many outstanding issues. There's a very good FAQ process that's been running that has shown some of them. There's been an ISTA FRTB working group that's tried to highlight some of the bigger ones, especially P&L attribution, emerging markets bifurcation, and many others. I also think there's still many issues that we haven't actually raised yet, and that will come as we go through the full implementation of FRTB. And of course, you have also bank-specific, I call them loose ends, but these could be little things that are bank-specific that has a particular impact as you're trying to go through implementing FRTB. So if you're looking at banks with legal structures, the whole desk restructuring may have an impact there. Then there's the aspect of the final text itself with the national discretions that are allowed, and how will there be differences in interpretation as we go through the implementation, both across geographies but also across banks. And that could in fact lead to each bank having to implement multiple Bs Especially large banks, you could even have that they would have multiple plans to deliver multiple Bs, but it could be, smaller banks would just have, one different version of an implementation plan. But all of this, of course, leads to a lack of a level playing field, I would say. It's very important in looking at where you are heading towards to get clear what is your optimal configuration. And this is perhaps one of the biggest challenges with FRTB. And it doesn't necessarily start with their structure, but their structure is one of the starting points in the text. So I put it in here as the starting point. But it's actually a bit of an iterative circle where you need to look at how will your desk be structured. What does that mean in terms of passing P&L attribution tests? What does it mean in terms of RWA and potentially broken hedges? Will they spike up the RWA? How many modelable risk factors do you have, and how much is ending up being non-modelable, also driving the RWA up? So this is really around the observability, and that again can lead to further iterations around how do you then restructure your desks in the period up to the go live of FRTB. Then there are other aspects of understanding your optimal configuration around what is the bank's strategic focus. I mean, some banks are in a cost reduction mode, others are keen to move into new business, and that would also have an impact on how you structure your desks, how you configure your FRTB implementation. Ultimately, this sort of circle and loop leads down to, well, is B, the journey from A to B, is B truly a better place altogether? Will you really achieve any capital relief? And in addition to that, even if you have capital increases, with the additional implementation costs and higher running costs, is it something you actually want for that particular desk? And so that very neatly leads us on to what is your sort of FRTB ambition and vision. Is it to be compliant, or is it to perhaps enable you to do much better and have a new platform perhaps that enables you to be performing much better in your business? But then, of course, you have the question, will the stakeholders pay for that? So that was some of the challenges around the end state where we are heading towards. Now I'd like to focus on the starting point. So if we go to the next slide here, it should come up now. Yes, it is. And starting again at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, how well do you really know your starting point? So, what are the ongoing changes that are in flight in your organization? Do you have full visibility on that? And what are the future transition states as FRTB moves along? Also, are there changes in business strategy? We already talked about cost reduction, but sometimes we hear in the news that certain banks might be, changing their focus. This is what I mean up here. Are there things that are happening that you should also take into account in an FRTB implementation? And of course, there's the simple aspect of how well are things documented, right? And I know it sounds very basic, but it does make a very big difference if it's well documented. Then there's the aspect of things will change as we go along towards the FRTB implementation. It's kind of a sliding starting point, I call it. And that could be due to poor business performance that leads to reprioritization. It could be, cost pressures. It could be new regulation coming up, or even some of the angry letters I see down there. But in essence, there could be things as we move towards the implementation of FRTB that substantially changes your starting point because things are moving on in parallel. And then you may have identified things that would be important for FRTB as dependent projects, delivering parts of the solution, which might end up failing. So that's also something to think about. So we've talked about how do we get to the FRTB implementation, what are the requirements and vision and strategy, optimal configuration. We've talked about the starting point. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about how we get there. And getting there, it's clear, again, starting around 12 o'clock, it needs to be an iterative approach or delivery because things are changing and you need to get into what is the optimal configuration, what is the optimal model as well. And prototyping lends itself very well to that. We've also seen a number of quizzes out there being a bit iterative and changing in their requirements, and that's, of course, also why prototyping is very useful. So in many ways, an iterative approach lends itself very well to an agile implementation methodology. But of course, it could also be done as waterfall approach traditionally, but just with a careful release planning. I think the big question here is by when. How much time you will have to deliver will really impact the implementation. And some of the people on the call may be questioning if I didn't read the paper correctly. Of course I did. But, you have to work your way backwards and understand, how much parallel run do you need to do? When do you need to submit the application package for your local regulator? And thus, how much time do you have to build? And again, here with an iterative approach, you may be delivering certain parts earlier and certain parts later, which may still give you the room to actually deliver within the time frame. If we move down towards how do you then get there, you need some kind of project or program set up, I called it here, and the size and scale of it really depends on, firstly, what is your starting point and how many internal resources do you have available. Also, the size of the organization, you could argue, is a factor in that. That leads very naturally on to you need to get the governance and stakeholder management set up. And here, the difference with FRTB, unlike many other regulatory programs, is that it does involve the business, it does involve risk, it does involve finance, product control if it isn't a part of finance, and of course also IT. And I think that is perhaps where I see, at least on the stakeholder management, the biggest difference to many of the other regulatory programs, because there's this aspect of, how do we achieve the right desk configuration? Where is our business taking us in future? By the time we go live in 3 years, the business may be looking very different compared to today. So that whole discussion needs to be also represented in the stakeholders and in the governance. Then in the program setup, you could also look to explore synergies with other programs already running within your firm. And here I'm thinking of things like MiFID II, or there could be other strategic programs around separating front office prizes into a sort of valuation service. But, there could also be things coming up where you say, well, actually, we want to look at combining some of the analyst resources on Basel IV, and maybe interest rate risk in the banking book could also be interesting. But yeah, again, how do you explore synergies with ongoing change in the bank already? And then what is it you need to do? Well, I put down simply here that I think there are a number of domains that you need to have work performed in. But, again, this all depends on your starting point, of course. But clearly there's an aspect of data, market data, observations for eligibility of risk factors. There's an area of building new expected shortfall risk engines, or maybe it's something you want to buy, but there's at least some work to be done there. And then, of course, aggregation and reporting will be necessary. And we talked about prototyping and the iterative approach. Maybe that ends up being your future risk engine. That could be. But at least it's an area where I see that there's some work to be done as well. And then I put on the top at 12 o'clock down there, utilities. And this is, maybe leading a little bit up onwards to, do you need external help here? Or is it something that you can do with the internal team and the resources you have available? And is it desirable to engage using external resources? Now, there's also the aspect of there are trade bodies engaging here, trying to drive joint requirements, and this could be a platform for building utilities. If we have new standards developed for product taxonomies, maybe even over time a risk factor taxonomy that we could all share and benefit of, and it makes it easier for vendors to deliver towards that too. So I think those are sort of, how do you create the setup of the program? What are the various interactions with external parties? I think internally as well, there's an aspect of defining the target operating model and how that changes. And here, the aspect of eligibility of own risk factors, but also how will P&L attribution work? And the additional reporting, and of course this is all solution dependent, but some of these aspects you could already early on start to define. So I think I managed to in 15 minutes squeeze everything in on one page, and I think it was quite fast-paced brain dump, but I'm very happy to take any questions at this point.
Okay, thanks very much, Bo. That was fantastic. And I'd encourage everyone at this point to submit those questions through that orange button. Any questions at all that are relating to that talk, or indeed about FRTB. I know that Bo is a bit of an expert on that and will be able to answer most of them. So I've got a couple of warm-up questions here, Bo, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on those. So first of all, do you think the requirements for FRTB IMA are sufficiently clear to operationally implement?
Well, I would say, this is really a tricky question, right? Because there's still, of course, FAQs out there and big sort of unknowns of what will the final legislation look like as it's being implemented. But, there are parts out there that you could definitely do. And banks are also doing that as a part of the quizzes. We're trying to do the P&L attribution tests, and we're seeing some of the difficulties. So there's definitely a lot of things you could do there. But I think, the challenge is, does it make sense? That sort of, does it make sense to do this? And I think this is very, very difficult to answer. And a part of it lies in uncertainties around new regulation coming up with floors. If you end up having a 90% floor on your IMA compared to the SBA, well, I haven't done the calculation for any bank, but I could imagine that it would be highly unlikely that you would go through a massive implementation, revamping your total risk infrastructure and building a lot of additional processes, and then still have to rely on a 90% floor, when we've seen some of the sort of calculations across quizzes where actually broken hedges has created a higher IMA charge than SBA. So it's difficult to see that everyone would implement IMA? And I think that's more the answer. Yes, I think you can implement IMA, but would everyone implement IMA? I think no, they would not. And I think that's the challenge, that there's not enough certainty around what is the consequences of IMA from an RWA perspective for you to make the optimal configuration of how do you structure your desks and prepare yourself for FRTB.
That makes sense. Okay, that's great. And you know, as for delivering the FRTB implementations themselves, are there potential synergies to be explored across the banks and the industry? And again, to the audience, you know, feel free to jump in here at any time with questions, and I can relay those to Bo. But yeah, your thoughts on that one then, Bo?
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that there's a new element of having to collect evidence that your risk factors are liquid, right? So this is the question around observability, 24 prices a year, no more than 30 days in between. And you know, that's an obvious example of everyone is having a new requirement to deliver this. And I think through the great work of Vista with a common product taxonomy, we would be able to lever off the prices that are being, and even quotes as they're being defined from vendors or from banks. There should be an opportunity to collaborate on gathering that evidence. But again, I think sometimes, you know, if you ask, does this really make sense, right? And yes, I do understand macro level, you know, we want risk factors to be liquid. But if we have, you know, an equity risk factor where we know the equity is quoted, you know, 10,000 times a day, does it really make sense that we need to collect evidence that that equity was quoted? You know, it's really spawned, you know, the beginning of a multi-million industry in just collecting data. And I think absolutely it does make sense to look at, could the banks collaborate on this to ease the pain of implementation?
That makes sense. That's great. And we've got some questions now coming in here. Again, we've got about 10 minutes, so keep your questions coming in, and we should be able to get a few more to Bo. The question here is, do you think banks will try to go for partial IMA with only the highly punitive regulatory capital charges desks applying?
Yeah, it's a good question, David. I mean, I suppose it depends a little bit on what happens on Basel IV as well. But I would imagine that if you have to submit the desks you want for IMA to your regulator, you also by default have an option not to submit desks for IMA and thus keep them on standardized or the SBA. And I think, you know, you will also have desks that will fail the P&L attribution test as it's stated currently. I mean, that may well change, you know, things like the variation measure. I'm hoping that, you know, that will change over time and be more pragmatic, because it seems that odd that you would have a perfectly hedged desk and then it would fail because because of failure in the variation test, as opposed to, you know, an unhedged desk that would have a much higher likelihood to pass the P&L attribution test. So, you know, you would have some opportunity ahead of the go live to restructure your desks, and through that, some of them would simply fail and not qualify for IMA. So, and in structuring that, you have some element of choice there.
Thanks, Bo. Next question here is coming is, in your view, are system vendors being helpful or distracting in the implementation of FRTB? So which areas are most suited to in-house development versus vendor supplied?
Yeah, I mean, I have always seen IT as an enabler. I think, you know, if you see it as a constraint, it's perhaps more down to how the A is right now. But you know, there's no reason why you shouldn't embrace the new technology and introduce that as a part of the change. Perhaps to create a more strategic implementation. So I think you're right. You can use IT as an enabler here.
Yeah, okay. And another question, if you had to execute a project now to prepare for FRTB, what would the goal / deliverable of that project be?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I mean, of course, most programs they start with a vision somehow entailing having an internal model, or we want to just comply, or we will focus on SBA. I think that's something that needs to be validated as a part of the quizzes and the prototyping you do, but there will always be some kind of a priori assumption of what you want to achieve. And I think for the banks, at least I've been engaged with, that is the focus, to obtain an internal model.
Mm-hmm. Next question here. For banks only doing the standardized approach, at which stage do you think they should be at this moment in time with their preparation? So in other words, do you think that some banks will be late in achieving FRTB within the timescales?
Well, where should you be? It's a difficult question to answer, but I definitely see the SBA as a no regret move. So you will have to build it, you will have to implement it. Do you need to be a first mover and have everything up and running and reports up and running and everything ready? No, you don't. In fact, you have until the end of 2019, because you don't need to apply for model approval on the standardized approach. You, in many ways, you have more time than for the IMA. But on the other hand, if you need to engage the business in the dialogue of what does this mean, then it is quite helpful to have numbers, whether it's prototype or the final implementation. Does that make sense?
I think so, absolutely. And another question here, just a reminder, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, so do send in your questions and we'll see how many we can get to both. Another one here, what challenges do you see for institutions with no trading activities?
What challenges do I see with no trading activity? I think it's more down to the banking book, trading book delineation. Will that still be will your portfolio still qualify for the current perception of the trading book, banking book delineation? Because it is changing. I think that's the answer to give here, and I think that's the key one.
Okay. And then one more question here. Given the lack of clarity on the regulation, is your money on the compliance date being pushed back?
I wouldn't see it as something where it's kind of a game of how can we delay things. I just see it as it is a very, very big challenge to get everything up and running for the 31st of December 2019, and also be able to do the P&L attribution test and I think maybe what we may see is some delay in the transposition into law. But some jurisdictions will not. And so I think, to keep a level playing field, it could perhaps make sense that you try and have a coordinated go live across the world. But what I would like to see is more staged implementation. That is not necessarily an all or nothing, but it could be that you do go live with the internal model, but then you do a longer parallel run on things. For instance, P&L attribution until it's properly calibrated, or you could imagine even a longer parallel run even on expected short form to get the calibration right. But that is a little bit depending on the Basel IV discussion as well, with floors.
Okay. And one last question, I guess, to finish on a big picture sort of point of view. From a macro perspective, are the current FRTB implementations meeting the regulatory objectives in your view, sort of in a nutshell? And that will be our last question.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to be honest and say the the FAQ process is not finalized. We haven't seen the final transpositions into law, but from past experiences of implementing Basel II, Basel II.5, Basel III, I see it as very fragmented, that there's a lot of national discretions. And so I don't necessarily see it as a level playing field that's being implemented. And I'm not sure whether that was the macro reasoning. I believe it was to ensure and reinstate trust in the banking system by creating transparency and comparability of the banks. And so by having many national discretions and perhaps, different implementation timelines, I don't necessarily see it as restoring trust in the banks. But I think this is a challenge as well for the banks to look at as we go through the implementation with, for instance, utilities. How can we constantly think about making ourselves more transparent and comparable? And maybe even there is a utility play around, things like benchmarking and other things that have, and there has been some attempts of this in the past, with trade organizations performing the role as benchmarker, but maybe it could be more formal as a utility under FRTB.
Okay, thanks, Bo. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. But thank you to everyone who joined us on the webinar. Thanks again to Bo Boyson for presenting. And of course, we're very excited to see Bo, amongst others, at Risk Minds International, which takes place in Amsterdam in less than 2 months, 5th and 9th of December. And we'll be seeing a whole range of presentations from risk managers, technical and strategic. So hopefully we'll see you all there for that too. If you do have any feedback on today's webinar or any recommendations for future webinars, do please complete our short survey, which will come up at the end of this webinar and it'll flash up on your screen shortly. So thanks very much, Bo, again, and hope to see you all very soon.
Thank you.